The man in the gray uniform didn't argue when Damian Cross told him to leave. He picked up his toolbox, stepped into the hallway, and sat down on the bench outside the boardroom door, like he had all the time in the world. Inside, 16 executives were fighting over a $240 million problem nobody could solve. On the conference table, between the water glasses and the quarterly reports, was a piece of paper Owen Calloway had forgotten there that morning, left behind without a second thought while checking the electrical panel before dawn. Claire Vance picked it up. "Read it. Read it again." Then she stood up and walked to the door. Owen Calloway started his shift at 5:45 every morning, long before any director or vice president had set foot in the elevator. He knew every floor of Vance Capital's downtown Chicago tower, the way other men knew their own houses, the particular groan of the third elevator on cold mornings, the stubborn pressure drop in the northeast corridor of the 22nd floor, the faint electrical hum behind panel B7 on 34 that nobody else had ever noticed. 5 years of early mornings had made him part of the building's own architecture, present, necessary, invisible in the way that load-bearing walls are invisible. His co-workers called him Ghost. He had never corrected it. He had not always been this way. 5 years earlier, Owen Calloway had been the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room, not because of anything he performed, but because of the quality of attention he carried. He had led a team of 17 engineers at Meridian Power Group, one of the largest smart grid development firms in the Midwest. He held 3 pending patents that his supervisor, Gordon Marsh, called the future of distributed energy in the American heartland. Owen had always gently tolerated the phrase. Then Noah got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in October, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Owen sat in the chair beside the examination table and understood each word individually and failed for a long time to assemble them into something that made coherent sense. Noah was 9 years old. He had just made the second string of his Little League team. He built model airplanes at the kitchen table and narrated the assembly to anyone who happened to be nearby. Owen submitted his resignation 72 hours later. Gordon Marsh called him back 3 times and offered everything full leave, remote work, reduced hours, any arrangement Owen needed to name. Owen listened to all of it and then said, simply, "My son needs a father who's in the room, not a father who's managing from a distance." Gordon signed the paperwork without arguing further. The years that followed existed in Owen's memory as fluorescent-lit rooms and bad coffee, and the antiseptic smell of hospital corridors that stayed in his clothes long after he had gone home. Chemotherapy cycles, blood counts, good weeks and bad ones. Noah lost his hair in March and grew it back by December. He complained about the hospital cafeteria food with the same cheerful conviction he had once applied to breakfast cereal, and Owen had been grateful for every complaint because complaining required energy, and energy meant his son was still fighting. Noah had been in remission for 20 months when Owen took the maintenance position at Vance Capital. Gordon had called twice in the year following remission. The second call included a number that made Owen sit down at the kitchen table and hold the phone for a long time. He declined both times. Stepping back into that world felt like a door he wasn't ready to open yet, not because the knowledge had left him, it hadn't, but because he hadn't figured out how to inhabit that version of himself again without it feeling like a costume. So he had kept the early mornings and the toolbox and the quiet, told himself it was temporary, and eventually stopped setting a date for when temporary would end. He was on his knees, replacing an air filtration panel on the 22nd floor, when Claire Vance walked past, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, the velocity of someone who had learned to conduct all her business in the margins between destinations. She stopped without looking down at him. "Is this going to smell like dust for the rest of the day?" Owen glanced up. "No," he said. 20 minutes. She nodded and kept walking. He watched her turn the corner. Then he went back to the panel and did not think about the exchange again. The Iron Gate project had been, in theory, the most significant achievement of Claire Vance's tenure as CEO of the firm her father had built. $240 million committed to a smart grid infrastructure rollout across the Great Lakes region, 18 months in development, before the first real alarm sounded in implementation review. The technical partner responsible for the load distribution modeling had flagged an efficiency gap in the fourth week. Actual performance was running 34% below projected benchmarks. On $240 million, 34% was not a rounding error. It was a crisis with a deadline, and a board of directors watching closely and expecting answers. An outside consulting firm had been engaged 6 weeks ago, 4 engineers, a project lead with 22 years of experience, and a fee structure that reflected their confidence. They had reviewed the model, rerun every projection, interviewed the technical team at the partner firm, and produced 3 separate reports that restated the problem in progressively more elaborate language without arriving at a solution. The board deadline was 11 days away. If Vance Capital could not present a credible remediation plan, the vote to suspend Irongate would almost certainly carry. The $45 million in exit costs would be the manageable part. The reputational damage from a failed flagship investment at this scale was the kind that tracked a firm for years. Claire was 36 years old and had been running a company she had inherited at 34. She had watched her father navigate crises of this kind and had catalogued carefully what each one cost him. She had not yet had the occasion to prove what she could do when something like this landed squarely in her lap. She had called a full senior staff meeting and laid the situation out without softening any edges. Damian Cross, her chief operating officer, had waited for her to finish and then presented what he called the rational path. Cut the position now, absorb the exit costs, preserve the firm's credibility through discipline rather than a salvage attempt that carried no guarantee of success. He used the word rational 3 times in 4 sentences. Claire had noticed and filed each instance away. "We don't retreat from something we built," she said. Damian pressed the precedent in the industry was clear. The board would ultimately respect a clean exit over desperation. Claire looked at him across the table and said, "Find another way." The room went entirely quiet. There was no other way available in that room. Everyone present understood it, and no one said so. The meeting dissolved and Claire stayed behind. She spread the Irongate schematics flat across the conference table and stared at them with the particular focus of someone who has been staring at the same material for 6 weeks and is beginning to suspect the problem is not in what they are looking at but in how they have been trained to look. She had read these diagrams enough times to describe each section from memory, and still the thing that was wrong inside them stayed invisible to her, the way a word becomes unreadable when you have looked at it past the point where it carries meaning. She heard the door open behind her and did not look up. Owen came in to collect the water service, the afternoon ritual, as regular and unremarkable as everything else he attended to without being asked. He moved around the far side of the room without friction, without drawing any attention to himself. Claire said, to no one in particular, "You ever look at something and know something's wrong but can't figure out where?" Owen stopped. He stood 2 meters from the nearest edge of the schematic. He looked at it without moving closer, without touching the paper. "The baseline load assumption," he said. "It's modeled for a symmetric grid. Great Lakes infrastructure isn't symmetric." Claire's head came up from the table. The door was already closing quietly behind him. She called Ruth Hensley the following morning. Not through Lena, not through the scheduling system. She picked up her desk phone and dialed the maintenance office extension directly. Ruth answered on the second ring, and Claire said, "Come up to my office, please. I need to talk to you about Owen Calloway." There was a brief pause on the line, not a surprised pause, more the pause of a person who has been expecting a particular conversation for some time and has arrived at the moment when it will finally occur. Ruth said, "I'll be right up." Ruth Hensley was 57 years old and had spent 3 decades managing building operations, the last 8 of them at Vance Capital. She was the kind of woman who said precisely as much as the situation required, and stopped there, not terse, not cold, but economical in the way that people become economical when they have learned that unnecessary words create unnecessary problems. Claire had always respected this quality, even before she had a precise name for it. Ruth settled into the chair across the desk, folded her hands in her lap, and waited with the patience of someone who had been called into offices to explain things on many previous occasions, and had learned over time that the best approach was simply to let the other person set the pace and the direction. She told the story without embellishment. Owen Calloway had walked into her office 5 years ago with an application for a maintenance technician position and a credentials file that made her read it twice before she accepted what she was seeing. A master's degree in systems engineering from MIT. 3 patents, all filed within the preceding 4 years. A senior engineering title at Meridian Power Group with a team leadership notation in the performance record. She had looked at the man sitting across from her, calm, clear-eyed, not performing anything at all, and asked, "Why this job?" He hadn't paused. "My son is sick," he said. "I need hours I can control and a job I can leave the moment he calls." Ruth had not asked another question. She signed the offer letter before he left the building that afternoon. Then, Ruth reached into the lower drawer of her desk. She had brought the envelope with her. Claire noticed, which meant she had anticipated this conversation from the moment she picked up the phone and set it on the desk between them. The envelope was old enough that the corners had gone soft from years of sitting undisturbed. Inside was a copy of the original application, and beneath it, a single sheet of plain notepaper in a clear and direct hand. "He gave me this on his first day," Ruth said, sliding it across the desk toward Claire. She stood, said she hoped it helped, and left without waiting for a response. Claire read the note alone. "Please don't share my background with anyone here. I'm not here as an engineer, I'm here as a father." She went through the rest of the file, slowly, the academic record, the employment history, the patent abstracts at the back. She read the abstracts twice. All 3 were in the domain of power grid optimization. 2 dealt specifically with asymmetric distribution networks. The language was dense and exact and described, with the precision of someone who had actually built the underlying system, the exact class of problem currently costing Irongate 1/3 of its projected efficiency. She closed the folder and sat still. He had known the answer since the first time he saw that diagram. He had been standing 2 meters away from it, holding a water tray. And he had known. Claire added Owen Calloway to the afternoon's Irongate working session through Lena's calendar at 10:15 that morning. The invitation was straightforward, 1 new name on an existing attendee list, no explanation attached. By 10:40, Damian Cross was on the phone. His objections arrived at the volume of a man who had long confused being loud with being persuasive. A liability issue. A morale issue. A breach of confidentiality protocol. Half the board would hear about this by morning, and what they heard would not reflect well on the judgment of whoever had made the decision. Claire let him reach the end of his list without interrupting. When he had finished, she told him the decision stood, thanked him for the call, and ended it. Damian arrived at the 36th floor conference room 15 minutes early and positioned himself in the doorway. He wore the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed an exchange and considers the outcome already settled before the other person has arrived. When Owen stepped off the elevator, toolbox in hand from habit, since no one had thought to tell him not to bring it, Damian moved to fill the threshold completely. "This meeting is for senior staff only," he said. "You don't have the clearance for this level." Owen looked at him. He took in the doorway, the people visible through the glass inside the conference room, the way Damian was positioned as though his body constituted a policy. Then Owen said, "Understood." He set the toolbox beside the wall, stepped to the side, and stood there, not pressing forward, not retreating toward the elevator, not offering any indication that he planned to go anywhere at all, just standing, with the quiet and particular stillness of a person who has decided to remain exactly where he is and sees no need whatsoever to justify or explain that decision to anyone. He waited. Damien watched him wait. The 3 junior staff members farther down the corridor had stopped pretending to be occupied with something else. Claire came out of the stairwell 2 minutes later. She found Owen against the wall, toolbox at his feet, looking at nothing specific. She found Damien still positioned in the doorway of a meeting he had not organized and had no formal authority to gate. She looked at Owen first, long enough to understand the shape of what had happened in the hallway before she arrived. Then she said, "He had no authority to stop you." Owen said, "But everyone in that hallway believed he did." That's the same thing. Claire stood with that for a moment, not because she was uncertain about what to do next, but because the sentence was the kind that deserved a beat. It was the kind of observation that only a person who had spent a long time on the receiving end of authority that was performed rather than earned would know how to make, and she heard the full weight of it. Then she turned her back on Damien Cross without another word and said to Owen, "Come with me." She walked him down the corridor to her private office, opened the door, and closed it behind them both. Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the hallway. This was simply what came next. She set the manila envelope on the desk and pushed it toward Owen without speaking. She wanted to see what he did before she said anything else. Owen looked at it. He did not open it. He did not reach for any convenient framing, did not make any move to get ahead of whatever she might say next. He sat in the chair across from her with the comfortable quiet of a person who has never needed noise to hold a room together. The envelope sat between them on the desk. The clock on the wall behind Claire moved. Then Owen said, simply, "Okay." Claire said, "You could have said something. The first time you heard us talking about Erangate in the hall, the first time you stood 2 meters from that diagram and saw exactly what was wrong with it." Owen looked at her without flinching or looking away. "I'm a maintenance worker," he said. "Nobody in this building has ever asked a maintenance worker for his opinion on a $240 million investment." He said it the way a person states a fact about the weather without heat in it, without self-pity, without any trace of an invitation for her to tell him the sentence wasn't true. It was simply the plainest possible description of a condition that had existed in this building for 5 years and that he had accepted as the terms of the arrangement without complaint. Claire pulled the Erangate schematic from the folder beside her laptop and laid it flat on the desk between them. "I'm asking now," she said. Owen looked at her for a moment, a checking look, not suspicious. More like the look of a person who wants to confirm that the door being offered is genuinely open before walking through it. Then he looked down at the schematic, and he began to talk. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes without stopping. He identified 3 distinct failure points in the load distribution model, not by referencing prior documents or reaching for other sources, but by reading the diagram in front of him and following its internal logic to the places where it broke down, the way you follow a river to find where it has been quietly and deliberately diverted somewhere upstream. He described each failure mechanism in clear and sequential terms. He was careful and unhurried and used no more technical language than the problem actually required. He sketched a remediation pathway in the margin of 1 page, using the pen Claire slid across to him, and what he drew was specific enough and grounded enough that it could have been handed to a contractor that same afternoon without requiring a single word of additional explanation. Claire wrote continuously while he talked and did not interrupt him once. When he finished, she set her pen down and looked up. "How long did you know?" she asked. "Since the first time I saw it," Owen said. 3 weeks ago." Outside the conference room, Claire looked at him steadily. 3 weeks, she said. "Owen, nobody asked." He said it the same way he had said it the first time, not as an accusation aimed at her, not as a complaint searching for somewhere to land. Just the plainest possible account of what had actually occurred. But it landed differently here, in this office, with his history open on the desk between them and 3 weeks of silence now accounted for. It landed like something with real and specific weight. Claire felt it settle. The meeting Claire arranged 2 days later was described to Owen only as, "I need you to look at something with me. Bring nothing." She had given him the floor and time on the calendar without a label. He arrived at the 36th floor at the specified time, carrying nothing, wearing the gray uniform with his name stitched on the chest in the same block letters it had always been. The room held 4 consultants from the outside firm: Claire, Lena, and Owen, 7 people in total, and Owen the only one without a laptop, a leather binder, or a business card anywhere on his person. The consultants had the settled, confident manner of people who had been through this kind of session many times before and knew how to occupy a room. They arranged their materials, adjusted the projection screen, exchanged the particular small talk of professionals who are comfortable in their own expertise. Owen took a seat at the corner of the table and said nothing. Preston Hale, the consulting firm's lead engineer, was 46 years old, Stanford-trained, with 22 years of experience in exactly this kind of high-stakes technical review. He presented the current model with the ease of long practice slides, advancing smoothly at regular intervals, technical language precise and assured, the narration flowing without hesitation. He had given variations of this kind of presentation before, and it showed in the way he moved through the material, anticipating the shape of each transition before it arrived. Owen sat through all 20 minutes of it without reacting visibly. He didn't take notes. He didn't nod or shake his head at anything on the slides. He didn't lean forward to look more closely at any particular diagram. He sat the way a person sits when they are listening to something they already understand completely, patient for the single moment when they will actually be needed, and unhurried in waiting for it. Preston reached the end of his presentation, clicked to a summary slide, and looked around the table. "Any questions?" Owen said, "1. What's your load variance model for the Northern Junction cluster?" The question was asked in the same even tone Owen used for everything, without any emphasis, without any sign that it was different in character from any other question someone might raise at the end of a technical review. Preston's hand moved to the trackpad. He scrolled back through the deck 3 slides, then a 4th, and his expression shifted in a way that wasn't quite readable from across the table, but that Claire recognized immediately as the expression of a person who has just located something they should have caught many weeks earlier and now cannot look away from. "We used the regional average," Preston said. His voice had changed in some way that was difficult to define precisely, but that everyone in the room registered. Owen said, "The Northern Cluster has 3 legacy substations from the 1970s. Regional average doesn't apply to that configuration." No one in the room said anything for a moment. The quiet had a particular texture to it, the texture of a room where something significant has just become clear to everyone simultaneously. In the hallway afterward, walking toward the elevator, Claire said, "Preston has been doing this for over 20 years. Owen said, "I know. That's not the problem. The problem is nobody told him about the substations." Claire, "It's in the site report." Owen, "Then someone didn't read it." Claire stopped walking. She looked up at the ceiling tiles for a moment, drew a slow breath in, released it steadily. Then she started walking again. She didn't add anything to that, and she didn't need to. Damian Cross had not been idle through any of this. He was a man who understood that influence was a direct function of information, and he had noticed that Owen Calloway was appearing in places that a maintenance technician had no logical business being in Claire's private office, in closed technical sessions, in conversations conducted at a register that should have been inaccessible to anyone without a directorial title attached to their name. He had someone pull Owen's complete professional file from the public record. What came back was not what he had prepared himself to find. The second patent stopped him entirely. Adaptive Load Distribution Protocol for Asymmetric Grid Networks. He read the abstract carefully once, then a second time. Then he opened the Irongate technical documentation on his second monitor and cross-referenced the foundational methodology references in the consulting firm's model. The correlation was not coincidental and was not subtle. The entire framework, undergirding the consulting firm's approach to the Iron Gate problem, was a derivative implementation descended clearly and without ambiguity from Owen Callaway's original published protocol. The firm had been retained at considerable expense to repair a system built on the intellectual foundation of the man who had been fixing this building's air handlers for 5 years. Damien sat with this for a long time. He understood what it meant for the board presentation. He understood what it meant for his own position if Owen Callaway appeared in that room. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes to careful men in difficult moments, exactly how little time he had to find a different arrangement. He found Owen in the parking structure at the end of the evening shift, a corner of the garage where he had confirmed the camera coverage had a gap earlier that afternoon. He had made sure of that detail. The terms he offered were simple and efficiently stated. Owen would remain completely uncredited in all documentation. Damien would carry the technical solution into the board report under his own name as part of an internal effort, and Owen would receive $85,000 in cash, with no contract attached, no documentation generated, and no trace left in any direction. "You get paid," Damien said. "The problem gets solved. Nobody has to be uncomfortable." Owen stood in the low, yellowish light of the parking structure and looked at Damien Cross for a long, unhurried moment. The expression on his face contained neither hostility nor any particular surprise. "Who are you protecting?" Owen said. "Damien." "Everyone." "Owen." "No. Just yourself." Owen said nothing to Claire about what had happened, but Lena had been at the second-floor window when the exchange took place. She had recognized both men clearly. She wrote a careful, factual account of what she had witnessed: time, location, the names of both parties, and left it on Claire's desk before 8 o'clock the following morning. Claire read it once, set it face down on the desk, and walked directly to the maintenance office without stopping to make a call first. Owen sat across from her in the small office and did not look away from her face when she entered and closed the door. She asked what Damien had offered him. "Money to stay invisible," Owen said. "Claire, and you said no." Owen: "I've been invisible for 5 years. It's not something I want to be paid for anymore." He said it without making any occasion of it, a man noting something that had become quietly and specifically true about himself without his having sat down one day and formally decided it. It was the first time in all their conversations in that building that he had said something purely about himself. Not about the technical problem on someone's conference table, not about Noah, not about what someone else had done or left undone. Claire heard the difference. She could not have said precisely why it stayed with her for the rest of that day. But it did. It was a Wednesday evening in late November when the building went quiet around them. Owen was on the 38th floor, replacing battery backup units in the emergency power circuit. Methodical work. More patience than complexity, the kind of task that settled well into a still evening when the building had emptied out, and there was nothing competing for his attention. The work required him to be on the floor beside the equipment, tools laid out in a precise row on a folded cloth, each step done in sequence and then checked. He had always liked this kind of work. It was honest, in the way that honest things are honest. It told you clearly when you had done it right, and clearly when you had not. Claire was at her desk on the same floor, the only executive remaining anywhere in the upper levels of the building. She had stayed not because any deadline was pressing, but because going home to the apartment she lived in alone had felt lately like exchanging one kind of quiet for another kind that was less tolerable. Here, at least, the quiet had Owen's presence somewhere on the other side of the floor, and the city visible through the windows, and the particular sense of a building that was genuinely resting rather than simply empty. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no particular reason for them to. They were two people in the same large space at the same late hour, each doing what they had come to do. The silence between them was entirely comfortable. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are not required to fill the space with anything. Then, Claire said, without looking up from the papers in front of her. "Noah, he's okay now?" Owen set the tool in his hand down on the floor beside him. "He's okay," he said. Two words that carried 5 years inside them, folded down to the smallest possible form without losing any of what they held. "He wants to play baseball in the spring." Claire said, "That's a good want." She meant it simply and without any additional layer, and the simplicity of it felt like exactly the right thing to say. A small silence settled between them again, easy, unforced, the kind that doesn't require anyone to fill it. Owen said, "You have kids?" Claire looked up from her papers. "No," she said. "I have a company my father built and left me before I was ready for it. Some days I can't tell the difference." She said it in the register of a small private confession that she had dressed as a joke, then looked back at the papers in front of her with the expression of someone who has said slightly more than they had intended to. Owen said, "Why didn't you leave when it got hard?" "Because if I walk away," she said finally, "it means he built it for nothing, and I can't let that be true." Owen nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, not in contradiction, but in the recognition of a person who understands exactly what it costs to hold on to something, because releasing it would mean that the effort behind it never counted. "I left everything I built," he said, "and it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the only right thing I'd ever done." She didn't have a response, and she didn't reach for one. Something shifted in the quality of the space between them, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to specifically, but measurably, the way a room changes when two people have stopped presenting versions of themselves to each other and are simply there. Owen's phone lit up on the floor beside him. He was on his feet immediately, toolbox in hand. "I have to go," he said. "Claire, go." He was 3 steps from the door when he stopped. His back was still toward her. "Thank you for asking," he said. He didn't turn around. The door closed softly behind him. Claire sat in the empty room for a while after that and watched the Chicago skyline hold its patient geometry in the dark outside the window. She did not open her laptop again that night. The morning of the board presentation arrived with the cold certainty of a late November day in Chicago, the kind of morning that has already made up its mind before the sun has fully cleared the eastern grid of buildings. Damian Cross was in the 38th floor conference room before the first board member arrived. He had spent the previous evening refining his presentation slides, clean and well-sequenced, the narrative confident, the solution framed throughout as the product of Vance Capital's internal senior team working in coordinated partnership with the outside consulting firm. Owen Calloway's name did not appear on any page of any document Damian had prepared. He had been precise about that. Claire arrived 8 minutes before the scheduled start, carrying a stack of printed folders under one arm. She moved around the conference table and placed one in front of each chair, 16 board members, 2 extras. She said nothing about what was inside them. Damian watched her work her way around the table and did not ask. Gerald Moss, the board chairman, was 69 years old, a former utilities executive who had spent 4 decades watching engineers and consultants and executives present technical solutions to infrastructure problems. He had developed over those decades a reliable instinct for the difference between a solution that had been assembled for the room and one that had actually been understood by the person presenting it. He opened his folder. He read the first page, then the second. He turned to the third, the patent abstracts, and read those with the same unhurried attention. His expression did not change. He closed the folder, set both hands flat on the table, and waited. Claire stood at the front of the room and said, "Before we begin, I want to introduce the person who identified the core problem in the Iron Gate model and developed the solution we're presenting to you today." She walked to the conference room door and opened it. Owen stepped in from the hallway, wearing the gray maintenance uniform, with his name embroidered on the chest in block letters. No laptop, no portfolio, no credentials beyond the standard building access card. He stood in the doorway of the 38th floor boardroom, the room where, 2 months earlier, Damian Cross had told him to wait in the hall, and looked at no one in particular, and was entirely still. Damian Cross was on his feet before Owen had fully cleared the threshold. "This is highly irregular," he said. "This individual is not," Claire said. "Sit down, Damian." She did not raise her voice. There was nothing aggressive in her tone. There was only the quality of a sentence that was complete in itself, and behind it, the clear understanding that the next sentence, if one were required, would be of a different character entirely. Damian sat down. Owen walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. A set of markers sat on the tray. He picked up the black one, uncapped it, stood a moment facing the blank surface, and then he began. He spoke and drew for 14 minutes. He diagrammed the original load model and traced with the marker the structural failures that followed from its foundational assumptions. He explained each failure point in plain, sequential language, the kind a former utilities executive in his late 60s could follow without translation, and that a room of investment directors could understand as the clear distinction between a recoverable problem and an unrecoverable one. He laid the remediation out in 3 steps and drew each one as he named it. When Gerald Moss interrupted mid-presentation with a question technical, precise, the kind designed by long experience to find the outer edge of someone's actual knowledge, Owen answered, without turning from the board, without any hesitation, looking directly at the man across the room, as though the question were simply the natural continuation of a conversation they had already been having. Moss wrote something on the notepad in front of him. He did not look up immediately. Then he nodded once, slowly, with the deliberateness of a person who has been looking for something for a long time and has found it somewhere they did not think to look. The board members filed out. Damian Cross was already gone. No one had registered when. The room held only Claire and Owen, and the whiteboard covered in clean, purposeful diagrams, and the quiet that follows after something real has been decided and doesn't require further discussion. "They're going to approve the revised plan," Claire said. Owen nodded. She looked at him for a moment and then asked the question she had been carrying since the night he said nobody asked. "What do you want, Owen? After all this, what do you actually want?" He took his time. He was the kind of person who gave time to questions that deserved it. "I want Noah to see that the thing I walked away from is still there," he said. "That I didn't lose it. I just put it down for a while." 3 weeks later, the board of directors of Vance Capital voted to approve a long-term technical consulting agreement with Owen Callaway. The motion had been introduced by Gerald Moss, a single typed page submitted to the board secretary the morning after the presentation, without commentary beyond the terms themselves. Damian Cross submitted his resignation 4 days after an internal review formally documented his approach to Owen in the parking structure. The review was 2 pages. The resignation letter was shorter. No one in the building appeared particularly surprised by either document. Owen received the contract on a Tuesday morning. He sat at the new desk in the small technical office near the building's service level. A real desk, a real chair, a window facing east that brought light in before the rest of the building stirred. He read the contract twice, found nothing that gave him pause, and signed where indicated. In the drawer beside the signed copy, he placed the one photograph he had carried from his old desk at Meridian Noah at 8 years old. Sitting on the hood of a pickup truck in a baseball cap, 2 sizes too large, squinting into the summer sun and grinning at something just outside the frame. Owen had kept that photograph through 5 years of hospital corridors and maintenance shifts and had never put it somewhere he couldn't see it. On Friday afternoon, he picked Noah up from school. His son studied his father's face with the frank directness of a 12-year-old who had learned that faces were worth reading. "Did something good happen today?" Noah asked. "You look different." Owen pulled out of the school lot. "Someone asked me to come back to work," he said. "Real work." "Noah, are you going to?" Owen glanced at his son, the baseball cap, the arm still thin from treatment, the expression of a kid who had come through things that would have unmade a lot of adults and arrived on the other side with his appetite for the world entirely intact. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Noah nodded and said, "Cool." Then he reached into his backpack and launched into a detailed account of the injustice of a question on that afternoon's math test. Owen drove and listened. Two halves of a life that had been pulling against each other for 5 years had finally gone quiet. Not resolved into anything neat, not wrapped into ceremony. Just no longer pulling. It was enough. Claire knocked on Owen's office door a few mornings later and found it empty. He started at 5:45 and she had arrived at 7, which meant he was somewhere in the building doing what needed doing, the way he always had been long before anyone knew to ask him for anything more. She left a new project folder on the desk, and beneath it, a small square of folded paper. She did not leave a note explaining the note. She simply left. Owen found it when he came back. "Noah's spring baseball, what field? I'd like to see a game." He stood in the doorway of his office, reading it in the morning light from the east-facing window, in the early quiet that had always been his, before any director or executive had arrived on any floor of the building. He held the note for a moment. Then he took a pen from the desk and wrote below her question, in the same plain, clear hand he had used on every document he had ever signed his name to. Wicker Park. April 19th. Bring coffee. He folded the paper along its original crease and set it in the center of the desk where she would find it. They had said he didn't belong in that room, and for 5 years, Owen Calloway had not argued, not because they were right, but because he had chosen something that mattered more than being right. Now the room was still there, and the work was still his, and the man who had quietly kept every light on in that building without once asking to be seen was, finally, seen.